Well, Mr. President, it's another week in Washington, and I think maybe the 52nd day since President Trump was inaugurated. And we're seeing the compliant mainstream media continue to spread falsehoods about the work of the Department of Government Efficiency and Elon Musk. As I've said before, the federal government has a spending problem. And like with any addiction, getting clean and solving that problem is not necessarily easy or comfortable, but it is long overdue and absolutely necessary. With the national debt at $36.2 trillion and counting, we have to start somewhere, and little things add up. And what better place to start than the waste, fraud, and abuse that DOGE is identifying? This has long been a bipartisan issue. I can think of everything dating back to the Grace Commission, where waste, fraud, and abuse was a bipartisan target, but apparently not with President Trump in the office and not with Elon Musk in charge of the effort to identify the spending. If you take a look at most things that the federal government is cutting at the recommendation of DOGE, it becomes harder and harder to become a DOGE skeptic, unless you're just blind to what they are doing. Last week I mentioned the waste that DOGE had identified with subscriptions and software licenses. And people may think, well, that's no big deal, but there's no reason taxpayers should be footing the bill for expensive subscriptions that go unused. DOGE uncovered the potential for massive fraud with an audit they conducted of government credit cards. At the beginning of the audit, there were 4.6 million active government credit cards, 4.6 million. After 2 weeks, DOGE identified nearly 150,000 credit cards that were thankfully unused or unneeded and closed both down. And I'm sure there's more to be done with 4.6 million active credit cards. There's no reason for so many government employees to have direct access to spending taxpayer money at the click of a button or swipe of a credit card. This is basic and would never happen in the private sector or in our individual lives. But the federal government, before this administration and before DOGE, these were commonplace and have been overlooked for way too long. There's some instances of fraud that we've known about for some time, but it's taken the Trump administration and DOGE to identify it and fix it. For example, the Government Accountability Office submitted a report to Congress last April, estimating that the federal government loses between $223 billion and $521 billion every year as a result of improper payments. The federal government's making improper payments and spending potentially up to $500 billion. Naturally, this was an opportunity for DOGE to identify this waste of taxpayer dollars. DOGE found payments to illegal immigrants using multiple Social Security numbers to submit Medicare claims, something for which they are not legally entitled. They found $57,000 in Medicare payments in 2020 for a patient who actually was recorded to have died 14 years earlier. It's amazing. You can continue to charge for Medicare payments 14 years after your death. In one particularly egregious instance, an illegal immigrant with a warrant out for her arrest was receiving more than $100,000 in loans from the Small Business Administration. But the waste and abuse of tax dollars goes beyond mere inefficiencies. Some of the other line items on the DOGE cutting floor are so patently absurd it would make your blood boil. For example, last week, the National Institute of Health canceled more than $500 million in grants for transgender experiments on mice. You can't make this stuff up. It's stranger than fiction. In a similar vein, NIH also canceled millions in woke grants ranging from promoting healthy relationships among transgender youth to delivering transgender services via telehealth. I think if you ask most taxpayers how they'd like their money to be spent, these programs would not make the cut. But that's not all. NIH is also canceling research grants that were going to universities in China. They canceled a grant for $1.7 million going to the Peking University in Beijing for the, quote, China Health and Retirement Longitudinal Study, close quote. Once again, I think American taxpayers would prefer to focus on things here at home, including their own retirement savings, rather than sending millions of dollars to China to study health and retirement security in a country which is our chief geopolitical rival. But that's not all. The list goes on. A group called the Inter-American Foundation has been significantly reduced after DOGE found egregious misuse of tax dollars, including over $900,000 going towards alpaca farming in Peru. That's on top of $800,000 for vegetable gardens in El Salvador, and more than $700,000 to improve the marketability of mushrooms and peas in Guatemala. I know that children frequently squirm at the dinner table when they're told they have to eat their vegetables, but I don't think this is an area where most people think our tax dollars should be spent. Unfortunately, this waste doesn't stop at the vegetable aisle. This foundation also spent more than $600,000 to expand the sales of fruit and jam in Honduras, as well as nearly $500,000 on improving the production of artisanal salt in Ecuador. Artisanal salt in Ecuador. Well, thank goodness the Department of Government Efficiency and Mr. Musk were key to identifying these egregious abuses of the taxpayer. But they've been going on for a long time until the Trump administration came along. So I'm grateful that now some of these outrageous expenditures of tax dollars are being exposed and dealt with. As I said earlier, Washington, D.C. has a spending problem. And like any addiction, it's hard to kick the habit, especially after you become adjusted to it. But it's time for a little cold turkey when it comes to this addiction. And many people who benefit from this gravy train don't want it to end. So naturally, many of our colleagues on the other side are concerned about DOGE, and they want to suggest that everything the federal government does is absolutely perfect. They wouldn't change a thing. But they don't really have any real substantive response to these outrageous examples that I'm mentioning here. They wouldn't change a thing. They see these stats and they tell you, don't believe your lying eyes. But those of us who've looked into it, who've taken the time to study what's been exposed, know otherwise. The government is not infallible. We have an unsustainable level of federal debt that threatens our economy and our national security. And the truth is, the Trump administration and Republicans are hard at work trying to address it to make the government more efficient and more affordable for American families. So once again, I'd like to do something that you don't hear very often here in D.C. these days, and thank Elon Musk for his service to our country in performing this essential and long overdue role. Mr. President, I yield the floor.